Picture this: a dimly lit corridor in the imperial palace of Constantinople, the air thick with tension and the faint scent of burning oil lamps. Emperor Justinian II, his face streaked with sweat and fury, grips the hilt of his sword as whispers of betrayal echo through the marble halls. In just moments, his reign will end not with a proclamation, but with a blade in the dark. This is the Byzantine Empire, where power was never just given, it was taken, often through schemes so cunning they would make even the most ruthless modern politician pause. Behind its glittering mosaics and towering domes, the Byzantine court was a labyrinth of ambition, where loyalty was a currency spent carefully and betrayal could come from the closest confidant. What made this empire so volatile? Imagine a world where every whisper could be a plot, every gift a trap, and every ally a potential assassin. The Byzantine throne was a prize fought over with a brutality that matched its grandeur. Emperors rose and fell like tides, some lasting decades, others mere months, their fates sealed by poison, daggers, or the sudden shift of public favor. This wasn't just politics, it was survival played on a knife's edge, where the rules changed daily and the stakes were life or death. And at the heart of it all stood the imperial court, a stage where ambition and treachery performed their endless dance. But the real question isn't just how these power struggles unfolded, it's why they mattered. The Byzantine Empire wasn't just a relic of the past, it was a mirror reflecting the timeless human hunger for control, the lengths we'll go to keep it, and the cost when it slips away. Over the next several minutes, we'll step into this shadowy world, unraveling the secrets of emperors and schemers alike. You'll witness alliances forged in secret, betrayals that reshaped history, and the shocking moments when even the most powerful rulers discovered they weren't untouchable. So lean in close, because in Byzantium, the truth was often stranger and far more dangerous than any fiction. The Byzantine court wasn't just a place of ceremony, it was a finely tuned machine of power where every role had a purpose and every whisper could tilt the balance of an empire. At its center stood the emperor, not just a ruler but a living symbol of divine authority, wrapped in silk and precious stones, yet his power was never absolute. Surrounding him were the Empress, often a political powerhouse in her own right, the cunning eunuchs who controlled access to the throne, and the ambitious generals whose loyalty could make or break dynasties. Together, they formed a web of influence so intricate that even the slightest tug could unravel fortunes. Take the eunuchs, for example, men who'd traded one kind of power for another. Barred from the throne but never from politics, they became the gatekeepers of the imperial household. They decided who got an audience with the emperor, which petitions reached his desk, and sometimes even which whispers reached his ears. Their influence was so vast that entire factions rose and fell based on their favor. Then there were the military elites, the strategoi, whose victories on the battlefield often earned them more loyalty from the troops than the emperor himself. It was a delicate dance: reward them too little and they might rebel, reward them too much and they could become unstoppable. But perhaps the most volatile force in the court wasn't a person at all, it was the factions. The Blues and Greens, originally just chariot racing teams, grew into political juggernauts. Their rivalries spilled from the hippodrome into the streets, and emperors quickly learned that ignoring their demands could mean riots or worse, a sudden change of regime. When Emperor Justinian faced the Nika riots, it wasn't just a protest, it was a near overthrow, with the factions uniting long enough to name a rival emperor before bloodshed decided the outcome. This was the Byzantine court in all its brutal glory, a place where titles were weapons, alliances were temporary, and survival meant mastering the art of reading the room. One day, you might be a trusted advisor, the next, your name could be scratched from the records, your statues toppled, your legacy erased. To understand Byzantium, you didn't just study its laws or battles, you watched the shadows between the throne and the dagger. The towering Theodosian Walls of Constantinople weren't just stone and mortar. They were the ultimate chessboard where imperial power was both defended and undermined. Stretching over 4 miles and rising up to 40 feet high, these fortifications made the city nearly impregnable, but they also created pockets of secrecy within the palace itself. Hidden passages, guarded chambers, and secluded gardens became the backdrop for whispered conspiracies and last-minute escapes. The very architecture of power here wasn't just about keeping enemies out, it was about controlling who moved and conspired within. Take the Chrysotriclinos, the golden throne room deep in the great palace. Its dazzling mosaics and jeweled ceilings were meant to awe visitors, but its labyrinthine corridors served a darker purpose. Behind gilded doors, eunuchs and generals exchanged favors, while disgraced officials plotted comebacks from shadowed alcoves. Even the walls had ears, literally. Narrow service tunnels meant for slaves to pass unseen became highways for spies. An emperor might dine in splendor one evening, only to wake the next morning to find the palace guard had changed loyalties overnight, their shift rotations manipulated in some hidden courtyard. And then there were the walls themselves, not just barriers but psychological weapons. When rebels or rivals approached, the sheer scale of the defenses could crush morale before a single arrow was loosed. But for those inside, the walls created a paradox: safety and confinement. An emperor might feel untouchable behind them, yet that same isolation could turn the palace into a gilded cage. In 595, Emperor Maurice learned this too late. When a mutiny reached the gates, his own troops dragged him from the palace, forcing him to watch as his sons were executed just beyond the walls he'd trusted to protect them. The Hippodrome, too, played its role, a sprawling arena adjacent to the palace where the roars of the crowd could mask treasonous conversations. What looked like a celebration of chariot races was often a barometer of unrest. Emperors watched from their private box, the kathisma, a secure vantage point that also left them exposed to the mood of the masses below. One moment of misjudgment, a favor shown to the wrong faction, a tax levied too harshly, and those cheers could turn to riots, with the mob surging toward the very gates meant to keep them at bay. This was the brutal genius of Byzantine power. Every architectural marvel served double duty. The same walls that repelled invaders also funneled conspiracies into choke points where they could be monitored or exploited. A garden pavilion might host poetry readings by day and poisonings by night. Even the sea walls along the Golden Horn, bristling with defensive towers, had hidden docks where a deposed ruler might attempt a moonlit escape. In Constantinople, stone didn't just shield the empire, it shaped its destiny, one betrayal at a time. Behind every great emperor, there often stood an even greater empress, and in Byzantium, these women didn't just support the throne, they redefined it. Take Theodora, the former actress who rose from the scandalous world of the Hippodrome to become Justinian's most formidable partner. While history remembers him for rewriting Roman law, it was Theodora who saved his reign during the Nika riots. As flames engulfed Constantinople and the mob proclaimed a rival emperor, Justinian's advisors urged flight. Theodora, however, refused to abandon the crown. Legend claims she silenced the room with a single line, "Purple makes a fine shroud." Her defiance galvanized the court, and Justinian's generals crushed the revolt in the Hippodrome the next day, a drowning descent in blood. This wasn't the act of a passive consort, it was the calculated move of a ruler who understood power wasn't given but taken. Then there's Irene of Athens, the widow who outmaneuvered an empire to claim the throne for herself. When her son Constantine VI came of age, tradition demanded she step aside. Irene had other plans. She engineered his overthrow, not with an army, but with whispers, turning his own advisors against him. The final blow came not in battle, but in the purple chamber where he'd been born, a brutal blinding that left him unfit to rule. For 5 years, Irene ruled alone, the first woman to hold the Byzantine throne in her own right. She minted coins bearing only her image, negotiated directly with Charlemagne, and proved that maternal bonds meant little when weighed against imperial ambition. But these women were no outliers. Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita, born into the Purple Chamber itself, married 3 emperors and outlived them all, each union less about love than leverage. When her second husband, Michael IV, grew ill, she adopted his nephew only to discard him the moment he challenged her authority. Her third marriage to Constantine IX was a masterclass in damage control, a public spectacle designed to shore up her waning influence. Even in her 70s, Zoe's beauty rituals were state secrets. Her cosmetics workshop doubled as a political salon where alliances were perfumed and promises dissolved like incense smoke. What made these women so dangerous to the established order? They mastered the tools denied to them by tradition. While men fought wars, empresses controlled the treasury. While generals plotted campaigns, they curated religions. Irene's push for icon veneration wasn't just piety, but a bid for papal support. Theodora didn't just advocate for women's rights, she turned brothels into convents, creating networks of informants among the converted. Their power wasn't a fluke, it was systemic. The imperial gynaeceum, the women's quarters, functioned as a shadow court where marriages were brokered and rivals discredited through carefully placed rumors. Yet their legacies were written in fragile ink. Later chroniclers dismissed Theodora as a harlot turned queen, painted Irene as a monstrous mother, and reduced Zoe to a vain figurehead. But the truth lingers in the cracks of history, in the laws they passed, the rebellions they quashed, and the unbroken line of empresses who followed their blueprint. In Byzantium, the throne might have been built for one, but it was often shared or stolen. In the gilded halls of Byzantine power, where bloodlines and battle prowess decided fates, the most unlikely figures often held the real keys to the empire. Eunuchs. Stripped of the ability to found dynasties, they were considered politically safe, neither threats to the throne nor distractions to the empress. Yet this supposed neutrality became their greatest weapon. While emperors and generals clashed openly, eunuchs mastered the art of influence, controlling access, information, and even armies with a subtlety that made them indispensable. Consider Narses, the cunning chamberlain who defied every expectation. In his 60s, when most men of his era were retiring, he took command of Byzantine forces against the Ostrogoths, not as a figurehead but as a brilliant strategist. His victory at Tagini in 552 didn't just reclaim Italy, it proved eunuchs could outmaneuver seasoned warriors. Back in Constantinople, he wielded equal prowess in the court's shadow wars, allocating funds to favored generals or quietly redirecting imperial decrees with a well-placed suggestion. His power wasn't rooted in titles, but in his control of the Sacellum, the emperor's private treasury, where gold could silence enemies as effectively as any blade. But Narses was no exception. The Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi, the chief eunuch of the bedchamber, held a role more potent than many ministers. He decided who gained private audiences with the emperor, which petitions were lost, and which whispers reached the imperial ear. Over time, eunuchs infiltrated every key institution. The postal service became their surveillance network, relaying messages across provinces while copying sensitive scrolls for the palace archives. Even the church wasn't immune. Eunuch patriarchs like Ignatius of Constantinople proved spirituality and political cunning weren't mutually exclusive. Their influence sparked resentment, of course. Military elites sneered at their softness, and aristocrats bristled when a eunuch's nod carried more weight than their ancestry. Yet every attempt to purge them failed. Why? Because eunuchs played the long game. While a general might rebel and be executed, a eunuch's power lay in networks, foster sons placed in key positions, debts called in at critical moments, and the quiet understanding that they alone knew where all the bodies were buried. When Emperor Romanos I tried to limit their reach, his own eunuch treasurer Theophanes engineered his overthrow by his sons, proving once again, In Byzantium, castration didn't mean weakness. It meant freedom from the distractions that toppled lesser men. Among the glittering ranks of Byzantine power, no force inspired both awe and unease like the Varangian Guard, burly Northmen whose axes gleamed as brightly as their oaths. These were no ordinary mercenaries. Hailing from Scandinavia and later Kievan Rus, they formed an elite corps bound not by local loyalties but by cold hard silver and a peculiar code of honor. While Byzantine factions schemed and shifted alliances, the Varangians stood apart, their foreignness making them paradoxically reliable. An emperor could trust them precisely because they had no stake in the court's endless games, only in the weight of their purses and the sanctity of their word. But that same detachment made them terrifyingly decisive in moments of crisis. Take the downfall of Emperor Michael V in 1042. When he foolishly exiled his adoptive mother, Empress Zoe, the people of Constantinople erupted in fury. As mobs swarmed the streets, the Varangians faced a choice: defend the unpopular ruler they'd sworn to protect or follow the will of the city. They chose the latter. Storming the palace, they dragged Michael from his sanctuary in the church, blinded him with brutal efficiency, and installed Zoe and her sister Theodora as co-empresses. In a single night, axes had rewritten the imperial succession. Their reputation for decisive violence wasn't just political theater. When the rebel George maniacs marched on Constantinople in 1043, Emperor Constantine IX turned to the Guard not as defenders but as executioners. After crushing the revolt, the Varangians pursued maniac supporters with chilling thoroughness, their Norse battle cries echoing through the streets as they hunted down every conspirator. Yet this same ferocity could be restrained, even poetic. Harald Hardrada, the future Norwegian king who served in the Guard, reportedly composed skaldic verses between battles, his poetry as sharp as his blade. What made these foreigners so indispensable? Geography and greed played their parts. Byzantine gold flowed northward, funding castles and wars in Scandinavia, while young Norse warriors saw service in Miklagard, the great city, as the ultimate proving ground. But the deeper truth lay in symbolism. To the people of Constantinople, the Varangians were living relics of an older, simpler world where oaths meant something. Their presence reassured citizens that even if their rulers were corrupt, at least the men holding the palace doors still believed in honor. Of course, that honor had a price. When the treasury ran dry during the Crusades, the Guard's loyalty evaporated like morning mist, proving that even the most feared warriors had their limits. Their legacy endures not just in chronicles but in the very fabric of power. Long after the empire fell, the idea of foreign bodyguards trusted precisely because they stood outside local rivalries would echo in palaces from Moscow to Versailles. The Varangians understood a brutal truth. Sometimes the safest hands to hold a crown are those with no desire to wear it. In Byzantium, the cross and the crown were never truly separate, and those who knew how to wield faith as a weapon could topple emperors with a whispered heresy. The iconoclasm controversy wasn't just a theological debate over sacred images. It was a power struggle dressed in religious robes. When Emperor Leo III ordered the destruction of icons in 726, he wasn't just purging superstition, he was striking at the monasteries, whose wealth and influence rivaled the state. By branding icon veneration as idolatry, he could confiscate their lands, weaken his clerical rivals, and redirect devotion squarely toward the imperial throne. But what began as a political maneuver spiraled into a century of upheaval, proving that in Byzantium, even God's will could be rewritten to serve earthly ambitions. The real battleground wasn't the churches, it was the streets. Iconoclast emperors like Constantine V didn't just smash mosaics. They staged public trials of icons, humiliating them as if they were living enemies. In one grotesque spectacle, soldiers dragged a revered portrait of Christ through the hippodrome, flogging it with whips while the crowd watched in horror or approval. These weren't acts of piety, but psychological warfare, a way to test loyalty, support the destruction, and you proved your allegiance to the emperor. Defend the icons, and you marked yourself for prison or exile. The policy became a litmus test, dividing the empire into factions that cut deeper than family or class. Yet the backlash revealed faith's double edge. When Empress Irene seized power in 780, her swift restoration of icons wasn't just devotion, it was a masterstroke of political rebranding. Overnight, exiled monks returned as heroes, their relics paraded through streets freshly scrubbed of iconoclast graffiti. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 wasn't merely a theological reset, it was a purge. Iconoclast bishops were demoted, their writings burned, and Irene emerged as both savior and sovereign, her authority sanctified by the very church her predecessors had tried to tame. Later emperors would flip the script again, turning religious policy into a revolving door of opportunism. Michael II, an illiterate soldier who cared little for theology, revived iconoclasm not out of conviction, but to court the army's support, their ranks still thick with officers promoted under the old regime. Then came Theodora, widow of a persecutor, who ended the controversy for good in 843, not with a council but with a midnight decree. Her triumph of orthodoxy was less about faith than legacy, ensuring her son's reign wouldn't be overshadowed by his father's sins. The fallout of these shifts rippled far beyond the palace. Religious councils became political theater where carefully packed assemblies of bishops would debate preordained conclusions. At the Synod of Hieria, convened by Constantine V, attendance was mandatory, but only for clergy who'd already pledged to condemn icons. Dissenters found themselves demoted, imprisoned, or worse. Meanwhile, the Pope in Rome watched these gyrations with growing alarm. His own authority alternately mocked and courted depending on which way the imperial wind blew. Each new decree widened the rift between East and West, proving that in Byzantium, even heaven's affairs were decided by earthly calculus. What made these conflicts so volatile was their intimacy. Unlike distant wars or tax reforms, religion touched every home, whether in the icons hidden beneath floorboards or the whispered prayers for a persecuted priest. When Patriarch Photius excommunicated Pope Nicholas I in the 9th century over jurisdictional squabbles, he wasn't just defending Byzantine pride, he was rallying the masses against a foreign scapegoat. Faith in the right hands could unite a fractured empire or fracture it anew. The Byzantines understood what modern rulers often forget. The most potent politics aren't those written on parchment, but those etched into souls. Basil the Macedonian's climb to power reads less like destiny and more like a masterclass in ruthless opportunism, a peasant boy who turned the Byzantine court's chaos into his own ladder. Born in the hinterlands of Thrace, he arrived in Constantinople with nothing but strength, charm, and an uncanny knack for being in the right place at the right time. His first break came not on a battlefield, but in the imperial stables where he caught the eye of Emperor Michael III. The young ruler, known more for his drunken revelries than statecraft, was charmed by Basil's physical prowess and street-smart wit. Soon, the stable hand became the emperor's drinking companion, bodyguard, and fatefully his assassin. But this wasn't just a coup, it was a meticulously staged takeover. Proof that in Byzantium, even the humblest origins could be buried under enough gold and blood. The key to Basil's rise wasn't brute force alone, it was his genius for weaving alliances through marriage. His first wife, Maria, linked him to the influential Martiniakos family, giving him a foothold in the aristocracy. But when ambition outgrew convenience, Basil discarded her, allegedly poisoning Maria to clear the way for a union with Michael III's mistress, Eudokia Ingerina. This wasn't romance, it was a political merger. By binding himself to the emperor's favorite, Basil secured a claim to legitimacy no peasant could otherwise dream of. The final twist: rumors swirled that Eudokia's son, future Emperor Leo VI, was actually Michael's child, a fiction Basil encouraged, knowing dynastic continuity mattered more than biological truth. Yet the true masterpiece of Basil's reign was how he reframed his crimes as divine reward. After strangling Michael during a drunken stupor in 867, he didn't just seize power, he sanctified it. Chroniclers loyal to the new regime spun tales of prophecies: a childhood soothsayer who'd foretold Basil's rise, or the Virgin Mary herself appearing to bless his coronation. Even the murder was rewritten as righteous justice, with Michael recast as a debauched tyrant deserving his fate. The message was clear: God hadn't just allowed Basil's ascent, he'd engineered it. But the Macedonian dynasty's foundation wasn't built on one man's cunning alone. Basil's successors doubled down on his strategy, using marriage alliances like geopolitical chess moves. His grandson Constantine VII married the daughter of a rebellious general, transforming a threat into a loyalist. Later emperors would tie themselves to Bulgarian princesses, Armenian nobles, and even Rus warriors, stitching the empire's fraying edges together with matrimonial thread. These weren't love matches, they were calculated risks, balancing bloodlines against border security. When alliances soured, the Byzantines had a ready solution. Brides could be cloistered, husbands blinded, and inconvenient children quietly forgotten in remote monasteries. What made the Macedonian era so transformative was its illusion of stability. For nearly 2 centuries, Basil's descendants ruled not through sheer terror, but by mastering the court's unspoken rules, rewarding loyalty just enough to prevent revolt, sharing power sparingly, and always keeping the church close. They turned paranoia into policy. Constantine VII's treatise on governing the empire wasn't just advice for his son. It was a survival guide, detailing how to play factions against each other without getting played. The dynasty's longevity wasn't luck, it was proof that in Byzantium, the smartest emperors didn't just wear the crown, they kept a knife in its lining. The year 963 began with a funeral that smelled of conspiracy. Emperor Romanos II, barely 24 years old, dead after a sudden illness that left his physicians whispering behind their hands. Officially, it was fever, but in the hushed corridors of the great palace, fingers pointed toward his wife, the stunning and ruthless Theophano, a woman of obscure origins who'd clawed her way to the throne through beauty and ambition. She stood to gain everything from her husband's demise. Their 2 sons, Basil and Constantine, were mere children requiring a regent, and who better than their mother? The speed with which Theophano allied herself with the empire's most powerful general, Nikephoros Phocas, only deepened suspicions. Within months, she'd married him, securing her position while Romanos's body barely cooled in its tomb. But this wasn't just a scandalous power grab, it was a turning point for Byzantium. Romanos's death cracked open a vacuum that would swallow 3 emperors in a decade. Nikephoros, the brilliant but austere general Theophano wed, initially seemed the perfect solution. A conqueror who'd reclaimed Crete and Syria, his victories plastered across church mosaics. Yet the court quickly learned that battlefield genius didn't translate to political savvy. His puritanical reforms, slashing court luxuries, curtailing corruption, alienated the aristocracy, while his refusal to flatter the crowds made him a recluse in his own palace. Theophano, realizing her new husband couldn't protect her ambitions, allegedly turned to a more pliable ally, her lover, the dashing general John Tzimiskes. What followed was a betrayal as theatrical as it was brutal. On a frigid December night in 969, conspirators smuggled Tzimiskes into the palace through a sewer, his path cleared by Theophano herself. They found Nikephoros sleeping on the floor, as his ascetic habits demanded, cloaked only in a lion's skin. The assassins beat him savagely before Tzimiskes delivered the final blow, a sword stroke so forceful it embedded in the floor. The corpse was dragged through the streets like common refuse, its mutilation a message: no ruler was untouchable. the aftermath revealed Byzantium's twisted calculus of power. Tzimisk's, now Emperor John I, couldn't afford to marry Theophano, her reputation too toxic, her ambition too naked. Instead, he exiled her to a remote convent, a move that placated the church while preserving her son's legitimacy. Yet, even in disgrace, her influence lingered. Those boys, Basil and Constantine, would inherit an empire hardened by a decade of chaos, lessons in treachery seared into their minds. When Basil II finally took full control, he ruled with an iron fist, trusting no one, least of all the scheming women of the court. Romanos' tragedy wasn't merely personal, it exposed the empire's fragile machinery of succession. A young emperor's death didn't just spark grief, it ignited wars, toppled dynasties, and taught a brutal lesson. In Byzantium, even a ruler's last breath was political currency. And as for Theophano, history would remember her as poisoner, seductress, survivor, a woman who played the game too well until the game consumed her. Theophano didn't just play the game of power, she rewrote its rules, turning her own supposed weaknesses as a woman into weapons sharper than any sword. Born outside the aristocracy, she lacked the noble blood that opened doors in Constantinople's elite circles, but she understood something they didn't. Influence wasn't inherited, it was engineered. Her marriage to Romanos II wasn't love. It was a tactical alliance with an emperor known more for his hunts and feasts than governance. When Romanos' sudden death left their infant sons as pawns on the board, Theophano didn't retreat to the gynecium like a proper widow. She moved faster than the court could react. Aligning with Nikephoros focused the empire's most celebrated general before the funeral spices had faded from the air. What made her so dangerous wasn't just her ruthlessness, but her mastery of perception. To the clergy, she played the pious regent, commissioning icons of the Virgin to sanctify her regency. To the army, she was Nikephoros' devoted bride, her public deference masking private control. Behind closed doors, she leveraged her beauty not for seduction, but for psychological dominance. Her famed golden hair and alabaster skin were tools, disarming men who mistook aesthetics for naivety. And when Nikephoros' puritanical reforms began alienating the court, she didn't plead or protest. She simply replaced him, orchestrating his murder with the precision of a siege engineer. The coup's brutality was no accident. The public dragging of Nikephoros' corpse through the streets wasn't just revenge. It was theater, a spectacle designed to burn one message into the city's mind: cross Theophano, and even an emperor's divinity wouldn't save you. Yet her greatest miscalculation was underestimating the very system she'd manipulated. John Tzimisk, the lover she'd installed on the throne, proved more pragmatic than pliant. He exiled her to a convent not out of moral outrage, but cold calculus. Her reputation had become a liability. The court might tolerate a murderess, but not one who flaunted her power so boldly. Even in disgrace, though, her fingerprints lingered. Her sons, raised under the shadow of her machinations, learned their lessons too well. Basil II would grow into the empire's most iron-fisted ruler, his infamous massacre of 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners a grim echo of his mother's uncompromising tactics. Theophano's legacy wasn't just in the blood she spilled, but in the blueprint she left, proof that in Byzantium, gender was no barrier to power, only a different kind of blade to wield. John Tzimisk didn't seize the Byzantine throne, he hacked his way to it, his path slick with the blood of the very emperor he'd sworn to protect. A general forged in the brutal wars against the Arabs, he understood conquest better than courtly niceties. When Nikephoros II took power, Tzimisk was his right hand, the hammer that shattered Arab strongholds in Syria and Crete. But loyalty in Byzantium had a short shelf life. By 969, the man who'd once led charges against enemy lines was creeping through palace sewers under cover of night, his sword itching for a different kind of killing blow. The murder itself was a masterpiece of betrayal. Tzimisk's didn't act alone. Theophanos' whispered encouragements greased the wheels, while disgruntled courtiers ensured the guards looked the other way. When the assassins found Nikephoros sleeping on the floor like some ascetic monk, they didn't grant him the dignity of a warrior's death. Blows rained down in the dark, his blood staining the lion skin he slept on as a symbol of strength. The message was deliberate. Even Hercules couldn't survive the politics of Constantinople. By dawn, Tzimisk wore the purple, but his grip on it was far from secure. Legitimacy wouldn't come from the sword alone. Tzimisk, the butcher of an emperor, now had to play the statesman. His first move was pure theater, publicly mourning Nikephoros, even as his men tossed the corpse into the streets. He donated sacks of gold to monasteries, not out of piety, but to buy the church's silence. The exiled Theophano, his co-conspirator, became his scapegoat. Banishing her to a convent let him posture as a moral avenger rather than a usurper. Then came the propaganda. Court poets reframed the coup as divine justice, painting Nikephoros as a tyrant whose puritanical excesses had invited God's wrath. Tzimisk, they claimed, was merely heaven's instrument, but the general knew propaganda wouldn't pacify the borders. To prove his worth, he marched east, crushing the Rus at the Battle of Dorostolon and reclaiming Bulgaria for the empire. His campaigns weren't just military triumphs, they were publicity stunts. Every captured banner displayed in the hippodrome, every procession of shackled princes whispered to the people, "This is what a real emperor looks like." Even his reforms served dual purposes. When he redistributed lands to peasant soldiers, it wasn't just justice, it created a loyal class of farmer warriors indebted solely to him. The irony, Tzimisk's greatest strength, his military genius, ultimately undid him. Returning from a campaign in Syria in 976, he died suddenly at 39. Some whispered of poison, others of divine retribution. But his real legacy wasn't in how he fell, but how he'd risen. In just 7 years, he'd shown that in Byzantium, even a throne stained with blood could be scrubbed clean, if you had the audacity to rewrite the story. Basil II didn't earn the title Bulgar Slayer through diplomacy. His reign began with rebellion, not just on the borders, but in his own court. Barely 18 when he took the throne, he faced an aristocracy that saw him as a puppet, a military that questioned his mettle, and a Bulgarian empire that smelled weakness. What followed wasn't just a consolidation of power, it was a masterclass in calculated terror. When two powerful generals, Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phokas, rose against him, Basil didn't just crush their armies, he dismantled their legacy. After defeating Phokas in battle, he ordered the rebels' head paraded through Constantinople on a pike, then stripped his supporters of lands and titles so thoroughly that entire aristocratic lines vanished from history. This wasn't just punishment, it was a message carved in bone: defy the emperor and your name would be erased along with your life. But it was in the Balkans that Basil's ruthlessness reached its zenith. For decades, the Bulgarians under Tsar Samuel had harassed Byzantine borders, their mountain fortresses seemingly untouchable. Basil didn't just want victory, he wanted annihilation. Campaign by campaign, he tightened his grip, not with swift strikes, but with systematic suffocation. He didn't burn villages, he seized harvests, leaving starvation to do his work. When Samuel's forces finally broke at the Battle of Claudion in 1014, the aftermath wasn't just defeat, it was spectacle. Out of 15,000 captured Bulgarians, Basil spared only 1 in every 100 men, blinding the rest before sending them home. The single-file columns of sightless soldiers stumbling back to Samuel became a living nightmare. According to legend, the Tsar took one look at his mutilated army and died of shock on the spot. Yet this brutality wasn't mindless cruelty, it was psychological warfare perfected. By leaving one eye in every 100 men, Basil ensured the blinded could be led home, spreading terror through every hill and hut. The cost of rebellion wasn't just death, It was a lifetime of darkness, a walking advertisement of imperial vengeance, and it worked. Within 4 years, Bulgaria collapsed, its nobility surrendering without further fight. What could have been a generations-long insurgency ended in a single stroke, not because Basil was stronger, but because he made resistance unthinkable. Behind the Bulgar slayer's legend, though, lay a paradox. The same man who mutilated thousands also stabilized the empire like no ruler before him. His infamous austerity, wearing a soldier's cloak instead of silks, auditing tax collectors personally, funded a military machine so invincible that the treasury overflowed despite constant war. He didn't just conquer, he administered, replacing rebellious lords with loyal officers and ensuring provinces paid their dues without revolt. Even his celibacy, often mocked by courtiers, was strategic. No wives meant no in-laws scheming for power, no heirs to divide the realm. Basil's enduring lesson wasn't just about fear, it was about efficiency. He understood that true power wasn't just in winning battles, but in making sure they never needed to be fought twice. When he died in 1025, the empire's borders stretched farther than they had in centuries, its coffers brimming, its enemies broken. But his greatest legacy might have been the silence he left behind, an empire so thoroughly pacified that it would take generations for anyone to dare raise a sword against Constantinople again. The Bulgar slayer didn't just rule Byzantium, he redefined what it meant to be feared. Empress Zoe Porphyrogenita's bedroom doubled as a throne room, a place where silk sheets and state secrets tangled with deadly intimacy. Born into the imperial purple chamber, she understood early that marriage in Byzantium wasn't about love. It was a calculated merger of bloodlines and betrayals. Her first union to Romanos III seemed promising, a handsome aristocrat handpicked by her father to secure the dynasty. But when Romanos' military ambitions eclipsed his devotion to Zoe, the marriage soured into something far darker. His sudden drowning in the palace baths in 1034 raised eyebrows across Constantinople. The official story claimed a fainting spell, but the timing was suspicious, just days after he'd publicly humiliated Zoe by refusing her demand to adopt their heir. The court's whispers grew louder when Zoe wasted no time remarrying, elevating her lover Michael IV to the throne before Romanos' body was cold. Michael, a former servant turned emperor, proved more pliant at first. He showered Zoe with jewels and titles, but his epileptic seizures and growing paranoia turned him unpredictable. When his health deteriorated, Zoe's influence waned as his brother, the eunuch John the Orphanatrophos, seized control. By 1041, Michael was a hollowed-out shell, dying in agony while John maneuvered to replace him with his own nephew, Michael V. Zoe, ever the strategist, played along until the new emperor made his fatal mistake. Thinking her powerless, Michael V exiled Zoe to a convent, sparking a citywide revolt. The streets erupted, the Varangian Guard turned their axes on the palace, and Zoe emerged from exile not as a widow, but as co-empress alongside her sister Theodora. Theodora, long relegated to the shadows, was Zoe's most unexpected ally and her sharpest mirror. Where Zoe relied on beauty and charm, Theodora wielded austerity and administrative genius. Their joint rule was less a partnership than a tense détente, with Theodora managing state affairs while Zoe focused on her final marriage to Constantine IX. This third husband, a charming bureaucrat with no military backing, was the safest choice, a man who could father no heirs to threaten Zoe's legacy. His survival until Zoe's death in 1050 speaks volumes. What separated coincidence from conspiracy? The pattern is too stark to ignore. Zoe's husbands died when they ceased to be useful, while those who accommodated her, like Constantine, lived long lives. Even the church's historians, usually quick to condemn ambitious women, hesitated to accuse her directly. Instead, they wrote of fate's strange mercy and God's justice, leaving just enough doubt to keep her legend ambiguous. But in Byzantium, where 3 dead husbands and a sister's timely rise could never be mere accidents, Zoe's story whispers the oldest lesson of all. The throne's most dangerous occupant was often the one who never wore the crown alone. Theodora's ascent to sole rulership wasn't just unprecedented, it was unthinkable. When her sister Zoe died in 1050, leaving Theodora as the last surviving heir of the Macedonian dynasty, the court expected her to step aside. Widowed, childless, and nearing 70, she was meant to be a placeholder, a figurehead until the aristocracy could crown a suitable man. But Theodora had spent decades watching Zoe's marriages and machinations from the shadows, learning one brutal lesson: power wasn't given. It was taken, and so, with quiet defiance, she did what no woman had done in over 500 years. She ruled alone. The backlash was immediate. The Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Carolarios, refused to coronate her, arguing that a woman's touch would defile the sacred oils of anointment. The military elites grumbled about taking orders from someone who'd never held a sword. Even the people who'd cheered her joint rule with Zoe now whispered that God would punish the empire for such arrogance. Theodora's response: she didn't argue theology or tradition. She simply ignored them. When the patriarch stalled, she bypassed him entirely, appointing administrators who answered only to her. When generals hesitated, she promoted junior officers hungry for advancement, creating a new class of loyalists. And when the treasury officials balked at her audits, she personally reviewed every ledger, her fingers tracing columns of gold like a general surveying a battlefield. Her reign revealed a paradox of Byzantine power. Misogyny could be weaponized. Because no one saw Theodora as a real threat, she moved unchecked. While male emperors faced coups at every turn, her opponents underestimated her as a mere woman, allowing her to purge the bureaucracy of dissenters with surgical precision. She didn't need to execute rivals. She simply reassigned them to remote provinces or levied ruinous fines for accounting discrepancies. The same chroniclers who mocked her as a spinster empress quietly marveled at her fiscal reforms, which refilled coffers drained by decades of war. Yet her greatest challenge wasn't external resistance, it was the crushing weight of precedent. Every decision was scrutinized through the lens of gender. When she negotiated peace with the Pechenegs, critics called it weakness. Had a man done the same, it would have been praised as diplomacy. When she chose not to remarry, they labeled her barren. Had she taken a husband, they'd have accused her of puppet mastery. Theodora navigated this minefield by leaning into her singular identity. She minted coins bearing only her image, something even Zoe had never dared. She presided over military parades in full imperial regalia, her presence a silent rebuke to those who claimed women couldn't command. And when the plague struck Constantinople in 1055, she didn't retreat to prayers. She commandeered private mansions as hospitals, proving crisis had no gender. Her death in 1056 should have been the end of an anomaly. Instead, it became a quiet revolution. Though the aristocracy hastily crowned the aging Michael VI, Theodora's 18-month solo rule had shattered a taboo. Future empresses like Irene of Athens would cite her as proof that divine right didn't need a beard. More subtly, she'd exposed the flimsiness of Byzantine sexism, how quickly impossible became inevitable when a woman simply refused to vanish. Theodora's epitaph could have been the empire's own reluctant admission. Power, it turned out, looked the same in any hands as long as they were strong enough to hold it. Michael Psellos didn't just write history, he weaponized it. A philosopher, courtier, and consummate survivor, his chronographia reads less like a dry chronicle and more like a backstage pass to Byzantium's most scandalous century. Unlike distant historians recording events from dusty libraries, Psellos had a front-row seat to the chaos, tutor to emperors, confidant to empresses, and when necessary, a master of the art of strategic disappearance. His account of the 11th century isn't just a record of who ruled and who fell. It's a psychological autopsy of power, dripping with personal vendettas, whispered gossip, and revelations so intimate they feel forbidden. Take his portrayal of Constantine IX, the aging emperor who married Zoe Porphyrogenita. Psellos, who served as Constantine's advisor, paints him as a man more interested in philosophy than governance, a ruler who commissioned lavish building projects while ignoring rebel factions at the gates. But dig deeper and you'll catch Psellos' sly asides, the way he notes Constantine's childlike delight in Zoe's theatrical makeup rituals, or his pointed remarks about the emperor's habit of falling asleep during military briefings. These aren't neutral observations, they're carefully placed needles, deflating imperial grandeur with the precision of a courtier who knew exactly how to settle scores on parchment. Yet Psellos saves his sharpest daggers for Isaac Komnenos, the general who briefly seized the throne in 1057. Having once been Isaac's tutor, Psellos writes with the bitterness of a betrayed mentor. He skewers the emperor's military reforms as the whims of a man who mistook battlefields for classrooms. And when Isaac abdicates due to illness, Psellos can't resist implying the stress of incompetence broke him. The subtext is clear: I taught him better. What makes this so revealing isn't just the bias, it's the rare glimpse into how Byzantium's elite truly saw one another when the mask slipped. The real genius of the Chronographia, though, lies in its omissions. Psellos barely mentions his own role in Michael V's blinding, despite rumors he helped engineer it. He glosses over his abrupt retirement when Empress Theodora took power, framing it as philosophical devotion rather than political retreat. These gaps aren't accidents, their silence is loud enough to echo. By curating what he shared and what he buried, Psellos crafted a narrative where he was ever the wise observer, never the schemer. It's a performance as calculated as any coronation. Historians have long debated how much to trust Psellos. His chronicles teem with contradictions, lambasting emperors for extravagance while praising his own patrons for the same. But that's precisely what makes him invaluable. His work isn't a pristine window into the past, it's a cracked mirror, reflecting the fractures and distortions of the court itself. To read Psellos isn't just to learn about Byzantium, it's to sit in its shadowed corridors, listening as a man who outlived 11 emperors leans in and whispers, "Let me tell you how it really was." Alexios Komnenos didn't just take the Byzantine throne. He orchestrated its surrender, playing the empire's factions against each other with the precision of a chess grandmaster. When he seized power in 1081, the empire was bleeding Turkic raiders slicing through Anatolia, Norman warlords knocking at the western gates, and the treasury hemorrhaging gold to buy fleeting loyalties. But where others saw collapse, 24-year-old Alexios saw opportunity. His rise wasn't a charge to glory, it was a slow, deliberate strangulation of every rival, beginning with the very family that had raised him, the Douci. The Doukas dynasty had been Alexios' springboard. His mother, Anna Damascene, had married into their ranks, binding the Komnenoi to one of Constantinople's most powerful clans. For years, the family treated Alexios as their golden protege, a brilliant young general to deploy against rebels and invaders, but loyalty in Byzantium was always transactional. When Emperor Nikephoros III, a frail placeholder installed by the Doukas faction, began faltering, Alexios made his move. First, he married Irene Doukaina, not for love but to weld his bloodline to theirs. Then, with honeyed words, he convinced Nikephoros to adopt him as heir, all while whispering to the Douci that he would be their puppet. The old emperor never suspected he was signing his own obsolescence. But adoption papers wouldn't be enough. Alexios needed chaos, the kind that made emperors disposable. Enter the spontaneous riots of 1081. Mobs suddenly flooded Constantinople's streets, their anger suspiciously well-directed. The city's bread dole mysteriously vanished one morning. Taverns buzzed with rumors that Nikephoros planned to sell the capital to the Turks. Then, as if on cue, the crowd surged toward the palace, demanding a stronger leader. The timing was too perfect. Alexios' allies had strategically pulled the garrisons from key sectors, while his agents seeded panic among the guilds. By sunset, Nikephoros was cornered, pressured to abdicate in favor of the people's choice. The Doukai, believing they'd engineered the transition, cheered as Alexios was crowned. Only later would they realize the riots had burned their leverage too. The coup's brilliance lay in its deniability. No assassinations stained Alexios' hands, just a weary old emperor retiring to a monastery and a populace convinced they'd chosen their savior. Even the church blessed the transfer, swayed by Alexios' promises to restore orthodox supremacy. But the real masterstroke was how he neutered the Doukai afterward. Key family members were given lavish titles and sent to govern distant provinces. Others were married off to Komnenoi relatives, their influence diluted. Within months, the clan that had ruled Byzantium for generations found themselves guests at Alexios' table, not its masters. What followed wasn't just a new reign, but a recalibration of power. Alexios didn't trust the traditional aristocracy, so he built his own power base, the Komnenian system. Loyal commanders received lands tied to military service, creating a new warrior elite dependent solely on the throne. The old bureaucrats grumbled as their tax exemptions vanished, but Alexios knew the empire's survival required gold, not nostalgia. And when the First Crusade erupted, he didn't resist the tide of Frankish knights. He redirected it, using their fervor to reclaim Anatolian cities while keeping Byzantium's hands clean. The lesson of Alexios' rise wasn't just about ambition, it was about patience. He didn't storm the throne, he let others clear the path, then stepped over their miscalculations. His rivals had expected a dynastic puppet or a brute warlord. Instead, they got a man who understood that the surest route to power wasn't through the palace gates, but through the minds of those who guarded them. Anna Komnene should have been Empress at least, that's what she believed. Born in 1083 as the eldest child of Emperor Alexios I, she was raised in the Purple Chamber, groomed for power in a way few Byzantine princesses ever were. Her father doted on her, allowing her an education usually reserved for male heirs: philosophy, medicine, even military strategy. She married the brilliant General Nikephoros Bryennios, a match that seemed to cement her political future. But when Alexios lay dying in 1118, the throne didn't pass to Anna or her husband. Instead, her younger brother John, barely out of his teens, was crowned in a hurried midnight ceremony. The betrayal, as Anna saw it, was complete. What followed wasn't just a passive retreat, it was a simmering rebellion. Anna and her mother, the formidable Irene Doukaina, rallied their allies in the weeks after Alexios' death, whispering that John was unfit, that the empire needed a steadier hand. Some sources claim they even plotted to poison the young emperor, though proof remains elusive. What's certain is that John discovered the conspiracy. His response was swift and brutal. Anna's lands were confiscated, her supporters purged from court, and she was exiled to the Kecheritomene monastery, a gilded cage where imperial women were sent to fade into obscurity. But Anna refused to disappear. Instead, she staged one of history's most brilliant acts of revenge. She rewrote the story. In the quiet of exile, she penned the Alexiad, a sweeping chronicle of her father's reign that doubled as a weapon. On the surface, it was a daughter's tribute, praising Alexios as the savior of Byzantium. Between the lines, it was a masterclass in subversion. John's name appeared sparingly, his accomplishments downplayed. Anna subtly inflated her own role, portraying herself as her father's closest advisor, the true inheritor of his genius. Even Bryennios, her husband, was painted as the military mind behind key victories, a pointed contrast to John's untested leadership. The Alexiad did more than settle scores, it exposed the fractures in Byzantine succession. Anna's bitterness wasn't just personal, it reflected a system that sidelined capable women while propping up mediocre men. Her exile wasn't unique. It was the fate of every ambitious princess who dared to reach beyond the spindle and the prayer book. Yet in her writing, she found a power thicker than blood, the last word. Centuries later, we remember John II as a competent but forgettable ruler. Anna, the would-be empress, is immortal. In the Byzantine Empire, a man's eyes were often the price of ambition, but not for the reason you might think. Blinding wasn't just about cruelty, it was political calculus perfected over centuries. Unlike execution, which could turn a fallen rival into a martyr, or imprisonment, which risked escape or rescue, blinding was irreversible yet survivable. A blind man couldn't lead armies, interpret divine omens, or sway crowds with his gaze, all vital qualities for an emperor. The mutilation was a message wrapped in grisly practicality. You may live, but you will never rule. Consider the fate of Isaac II Angelos. He'd risen to power in 1185 after a populist revolt, his charm and noble bearing winning over Constantinople's masses. But 12 years later, his own brother Alexios III coveted the throne. A quick stab in the dark might have sufficed, but Alexios chose something far more Byzantine. Isaac wasn't killed, he was blinded with red-hot irons, the scorch marks ensuring no miraculous recovery of sight could inspire rebellions later. Yet even this wasn't mindless savagery, it was theater. The act was public enough to spread terror among potential allies, but discreet enough to avoid turning Isaac into a sympathetic figure. Alexios understood the optics. A dead emperor might be avenged, a broken one was simply forgotten. The practice's genius lay in its flexibility. Sometimes only one eye was taken, leaving the victim half visible, a warning without total ruin. Other times, like with Romanos IV after the Battle of Manzikert, blinding was the coup de grace after months of humiliation. Defeated by the Seljuks in 1071, Romanos was paraded in chains before being blinded so brutally he died of his wounds. Here, the mutilation wasn't just about disqualification, it was a slow death sentence dressed as mercy. Even the method carried symbolism. Hot irons caused agonizing but controlled damage, while gouging with daggers favored during the chaotic 10th century often led to fatal infections. The tools chosen sent their own messages. Was this a judicial act or a frenzied lynch mob's work? When Basil II blinded 15,000 Bulgarians but left one eye in every 100 men, it wasn't just sadism, it was logistics. Those one-eyed survivors could lead their blind comrades home, transforming into living billboards of imperial terror. But the darkest truth about Byzantine blinding was its perverse legality. The Church, which opposed execution as a sin, tacitly endorsed it as a merciful alternative. Emperors could claim they'd spared a life while still removing all threat. The victim, meanwhile, faced a fate worse than death in a society that viewed physical perfection as a sign of divine favor. A blind ex-emperor like John VII Palaiologos might linger for years in monastic shadows, his presence a whispered cautionary tale. This wasn't just violence, it was psychological warfare refined over generations. Blinding turned the human body into a parchment where power wrote its darkest proverbs. And in Byzantium, where the throne was always one whispered plot away from changing hands, the lesson was clear. Sometimes the most effective way to hold onto power was to ensure others could never see it. The Fourth Crusade was meant to be a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem, but it became Byzantium's greatest humiliation, a knife twisted by its own elites. By 1203, Constantinople was already bleeding from self-inflicted wounds. Emperor Alexios III had bankrupted the treasury buying loyalty, while his nephew, the exiled Prince Alexios IV, languished in Europe, nursing grievances and dreaming of restoration. What happened next wasn't just an invasion. It was a coup disguised as a crusade, proving that no empire falls solely to outside forces. It's hollowed out first from within. Young Alexios IV saw the arriving crusader armies not as invaders but as tools. Desperate to reclaim the throne stolen by his uncle, he struck a devil's bargain with their leaders, financed their campaign he promised, and in return they'd install him as emperor. The Crusaders, stranded in Venice with no funds to reach the Holy Land, eagerly seized the opportunity. But the real betrayal wasn't their alliance, it was how Byzantine factions turned the crisis into their own power play. When Alexios and the Crusaders arrived at Constantinople's walls, the city's ruling class fractured. Some nobles saw the young prince as a puppet who could break Alexios III's grip. Others feared the Latins more than they despised their own emperor. The result was paralysis. Alexios III's response sealed the empire's fate. Instead of crushing the Crusaders swiftly, he hesitated, then fled in the night, stuffing the palace treasury into his saddlebags. His cowardice left a vacuum, and his nephew was briefly crowned Alexios IV. But the new emperor soon discovered that promises made to desperate men are impossible to keep. Strapped for cash himself, he couldn't pay the Crusaders the exorbitant sum he'd pledged. When he turned to taxing churches and melting down holy relics for gold, the people of Constantinople revolted. The very factions that had tolerated his rule now denounced him as a heretic and a traitor. Within months, Alexios IV was strangled in his prison cell by a rival, his body left to rot as a warning. With their patron dead and their payments vanished, the Crusaders faced a choice: starve outside the walls or take what they'd been promised by force. What followed was no battle but a slaughter. On April 12, 1204, the invaders breached Constantinople's defenses not through strength, but because the defenders, divided by years of infighting, simply gave up. Some gates were left unguarded, others were opened by traitors hoping to profit from the chaos. For 3 days, the Crusaders pillaged the greatest city in Christendom, desecrating churches, melting ancient statues for bullion, and carting away relics like common loot. The Library of Constantinople, a millennium of knowledge, burned. The sack's true tragedy wasn't the violence, it was the inevitability. Byzantium's elites had spent decades jockeying for power, each faction willing to weaken the whole if it meant advantage for themselves. The Crusaders merely exploited fractures that already ran bone deep. Even the empire's eventual restoration in 1261 couldn't undo the damage. The once mighty state was reduced to a rump kingdom, its authority shattered, its economy in ruins. The Fourth Crusade didn't kill Byzantium, but it proved the empire had already forgotten how to survive its own courtiers. Michael VIII Palaiologos didn't reclaim Constantinople so much as he slipped through its shattered gates under cover of night. In 1261, the city that had been the jewel of Christendom for nearly a millennium lay broken, its walls scarred by Crusader fires, its palaces looted, its spirit gutted. But where others saw ruin, Michael saw opportunity. With a small band of soldiers, he infiltrated the city while the occupying Latins slept, their grip weakened by infighting. By dawn, his banners flew from the Blasciani Palace, and Byzantium, or what was left of it, had a ruler again. Yet this wasn't a triumphant restoration, it was a desperate gambit. The empire Michael inherited was a ghost. Anatolia, once the empire's breadbasket, had been carved up by Turkic beyliks. The Balkans seethed with Serbian and Bulgarian warlords eyeing the weakened throne. Even the Byzantine aristocracy, those who hadn't fled or collaborated with the Latins, were more interested in jockeying for scraps than rebuilding. Michael's genius lay in his pragmatism. He knew brute force wouldn't save Byzantium, so he turned to guile. He courted the Genoese with trade concessions, using their gold to refill his coffers. He negotiated with the Pope, dangling the illusion of church unity to ward off another crusade. And when the Mongols under Hulagu Khan crushed the Seljuks, Michael pivoted swiftly, signing treaties with these new power players to buy breathing room. But the cracks in his strategy began with his own family. The Palaiologos dynasty wasn't a united front, it was a nest of vipers. Michael's own brother, John, conspired with Bulgarian Tsars to seize the throne, forcing Michael to blind him in a brutal but customary act of political neutering. His son and heir, Andronikos II, proved weak-willed and pious, more interested in theological debates than the art of rule. And then there was Michael's greatest miscalculation, the Union of Lyons in 1274. To secure papal support against Charles of Anjou's looming invasion, he agreed to a symbolic submission of the Orthodox Church to Rome. The move backfired spectacularly. Byzantine clergy revolted, the people saw it as betrayal, and Michael died in 1282 with his legacy poisoned by distrust. The true tragedy of the Palaeologoi wasn't their lack of vision, it was their inability to stop fighting among themselves long enough to enact it. Andronikos II's 50-year reign became a masterclass in decay. He inherited an empire teetering on recovery and left it bankrupt, disbanding the navy to save gold just as Turkish Ghazis began raiding the coasts. His grandson, Andronikos III, spent more energy feuding with him than governing, triggering a civil war that left the countryside open to Ottoman raids. Even when the empire produced capable rulers like John VI Cantacuzenios, they were too busy battling cousins and in-laws to mount a united defense. The final irony, the Palaeologoi's greatest rival wasn't the Ottomans, it was their own refusal to adapt. While Mehmed the Conqueror embraced gunpowder and centralized rule, Byzantium's elites clung to archaic titles and ceremonial precedents, squabbling over who got to stand closer to the emperor during processions as the noose tightened. By 1453, when Constantine XI made his last stand at the Theodosian Walls, the empire he defended wasn't just outmatched, it had already been hollowed out by generations of myopic ambition. The Palaeologos' restoration didn't fail because it lacked moments of brilliance. It failed because in the end, even its brightest sparks were smothered by the dynasty's own relentless infighting. Constantine XI knew the numbers were against him from the start. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, a city once teeming with 500,000 now housing barely 50,000 souls. Its legendary walls, which had repelled invaders for 1,000 years, were manned by fewer than 7,000 defenders against Mehmed II's 80,000. Yet Constantine refused the safe exile his brothers had chosen, gambling instead on a web of desperate alliances. His appeals to Rome brought a paltry contingent of Genoese mercenaries led by Giovanni Giustiniani, while Venetian ships lurked offshore, their captains under orders to intervene only if victory seemed certain. Even the promises of Hungarian cannonmaster Orban, who'd initially offered his services to Byzantium before defecting to the Ottomans, now boomeranged against the city as his massive bombard shattered the very walls he'd once sworn to defend. The final act played out with agonizing inevitability. Mehmed's engineers built a road of greased logs to drag his fleet overland into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain barrier that had protected the harbor for centuries. Inside the city, Constantine's advisors turned on each other, some urging surrender to spare the populace, others demanding martyrdom. The emperor himself patrolled the ramparts in purple-dyed boots, offering gold coins to boost morale, but the gesture rang hollow when the treasury could no longer pay the garrison. Then came the betrayal that cut deepest. On May 29th, as Ottoman troops poured through a neglected sally port left unguarded by panicked defenders, the Kirkaporta gate was flung open from within. Some blamed the Genoese in their panic to flee, others whispered of a disgruntled noble family settling old scores. Whoever turned the key, the result was the same, janissaries streaming into the streets, their crescent banners eclipsing the double-headed eagle over the Blasphemy Palace. Constantine's final moments vanished into myth. Some said he tore off his imperial insignia and charged into the fray as a common soldier, his body lost in the carnage. Others claimed he hanged himself with his own sash rather than face capture. Mehmed, upon entering the city, reportedly wept at the sight of Hagia Sophia's desecration, not out of piety but regret that such a prize had been so diminished by time. The Ottomans would rename it Istanbul, but the true death knell hadn't been the fall of stone and mortar. It was the silence that followed the absence of the court's intricate dances of power, the stilled whispers of eunuchs in marble corridors, the hollowed-out rituals of an empire that had spent its final centuries devouring itself. The Byzantines hadn't just been conquered, they'd perfected the art of their own undoing long before the first Ottoman cannonballs struck the Theodosian Walls. Whispered plots in Byzantium didn't always need dark corridors. Sometimes they unfolded in broad daylight, hidden behind innocuous letters or even baked into bread. The empire's spies and diplomats mastered the art of steganographia, the concealment of messages within everyday objects. Take Emperor Constantine VII's diplomatic manual, which advised envoys to scribble sensitive reports between the lines of harmless-looking parchments using milk-based ink. Held over a candle, the heat would darken the hidden text while leaving the surface message untouched. A merchant delivering a mundane trade agreement might unknowingly carry secrets that could spark wars or topple dynasties. But the true genius lay in misdirection. Byzantine cryptographers developed cipher systems so sophisticated they wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. The Polybius square, a grid mapping letters to numerical coordinates, turned phrases into seemingly random number sequences. A seemingly innocent inventory list, 3 bolts of silk, 5 jars of honey, could mask troop movements when read with the right key. Even the humble triskels, a 3-legged symbol found on coins and seals, sometimes concealed tiny dots along its curves indicating message drop locations. Some of the boldest schemes relied on sheer audacity. During the siege of Constantinople in 717, Leo the Isaurian allegedly received intelligence inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread, a trick that later inspired the phrase "breaking bread" for secret exchanges. Centuries later, Anna Komnene described how her father Alexios I used graphene adalon, unseen writing, to coordinate with agents behind enemy lines. His spies would soak parchment in plant gall extracts. When brushed with iron sulfate, the invisible words emerged like ghostly handwriting. The most chilling examples weren't tools of war but betrayal. When General Belisarius stood trial for conspiracy in 562, prosecutors presented letters soaked in vinegar to reveal erased annotations, proof that a trusted commander had secretly critiqued Justinian's tactics. Even religious icons played their part. Mosaic tiles in the Hagia Sophia's narthex were rumored to conceal coded rebel messages, their patterns decipherable only to initiates. What made Byzantine cryptography so formidable wasn't just its complexity, it was the understanding that every interaction was a potential front. A courtier's compliment might carry a veiled threat, a nun's prayer book hold battle plans, and a child's toy conceal the coordinates of a traitor's meeting. In an empire where words could mean death, survival depended on reading what wasn't written as much as what was. The imperial apothecary's workshop smelled of crushed rose petals and bitter almonds, a deceptively serene space where healing tinctures and deadly powders shared the same polished shelves. These court physicians held a dual mandate: to prolong life, and when whispered orders came, to end it with discretion. Emperor John V's sudden decline in 1391 raised eyebrows across Constantinople. The official record cited natural illness, but the symptoms, violent stomach cramps, skin mottled like spoiled parchment, pointed to a far darker prescription. Arsenic, the silent killer, left no obvious marks, only a trail of suffering and plausible deniability. Apothecaries didn't work in isolation, they were nodes in a sprawling network. Herbs like wolfsbane and hemlock arrived via Venetian traders labeled as medicinal imports, while royal gardeners cultivated innocent-looking flowers, larkspur, foxglove, whose petals could be distilled into lethal brews. The real artistry lay in dosage. A pinch of white arsenic in wine might mimic a slow fever, while a slightly heavier hand brought agony within hours. Some concoctions were designed for delayed effect, allowing the dispenser to be miles away when the victim collapsed. Others, like the infamous acqua tofana, a favorite of Italian assassins, required multiple doses to avoid suspicion, perfect for disposing of ailing emperors whose deaths needed to seem inevitable. The true power of these poisoners wasn't just in their potions, but in their silence. Apothecaries swore oaths to protect the identities of their patrons, knowing their own survival depended on discretion. When rumors swirled about John V's demise, the palace's chief physician, a man trained in Salerno's finest medical schools, vanished overnight, likely dispatched to some distant monastery before he could be questioned. Even tools were disposable. Mortar and pestles used to grind toxic powders were often tossed into the Bosporus, their telltale residues sinking beneath the waves. Yet accidents happened. In 1425, an overzealous apprentice mistakenly added nightshade extract to a visiting noble's tonic instead of chamomile. The resulting convulsions exposed the court's darkest secret, that the line between medicine and murder was as thin as the blade of a lancet. The boy's body was found floating near the docks the next morning, a cautionary tale etched in blood. What made Byzantine poisonings so insidious was their intimacy. Unlike a dagger's public strike or a battlefield's chaos, these deaths unfolded in private chambers, blurring the line between illness and conspiracy. When Empress Irene of Athens allegedly laced her son's wine with slow-acting toxins, his decline was blamed on divine displeasure. By the time the truth dawned, the evidence had been swallowed literally. In an empire where trust was as fragile as an opium-laced delicacy, even a sip from the wrong cup could rewrite history. The apothecary's legacy wasn't just in the lives they ended, but in the shadows they cast over every golden goblet raised in the palace's flickering lamplight. The whispers of Byzantine corridors echo louder than you might think in today's political arenas. While marble palaces have been replaced by glass skyscrapers and daggers by data leaks, the core playbook of power remains strikingly familiar. Take the calculated leak, a tactic as old as Theodora's reign, when discrediting a rival meant strategically losing scandalous parchments where the right eyes might find them. Modern spin doctors employ nearly identical strategies, timing damning revelations to dominate news cycles or derail opponents' campaigns. The tools have evolved from scribes to social media bots, but the goal hasn't changed: control the narrative before it controls you. Consider the Byzantine practice of proskyneses, the ritualized bowing that reinforced hierarchy. Today's version plays out in press conferences and photo ops, where seating arrangements and podium placements telegraph unspoken power dynamics. A minor official shuffled to the edge of a diplomatic group photo sends the same message as a eunuch barred from the inner sanctum: know your place. Even the empire's reliance on foreign mercenaries finds its parallel in modern lobbying firms and private military contractors, outsourced influence peddlers who pledge loyalty only until the next highest bidder appears. The real masterstroke of Byzantine politics, though, was the art of plausible deniability, a skill modern leaders still wield with precision. When Alexios Komnenos needed to weaken a rival without bloodshed, he'd assign them a lucrative but distant governorship, effectively exiling them under the guise of promotion. Sound familiar? Contemporary political reshuffles often serve the same purpose, parking troublesome figures in ceremonial roles far from decision-making hubs. And just as Byzantine emperors used ecclesiastical councils to rubber-stamp their agendas, today's governments lean on bipartisan commissions or judicial reviews to legitimize controversial policies. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the weaponization of crisis. The Komnenoi dynasty didn't just survive the Crusades, they redirected them, turning Frankish fervor against their own Turkish enemies. Modern parallels abound, leaders framing immigration crackdowns as national security measures, or spinning economic failures into calls for expanded executive powers. The playbook hasn't changed because human nature hasn't. Fear still consolidates power more effectively than any policy victory. Yet amidst these shadows, one lesson shines clear. Systems built on perpetual distrust eventually consume themselves. Byzantium's paranoid bureaucracy, where every official spied on their subordinates, created stagnation long before the Ottomans arrived. Today's hyper-polarized politics, where compromise is treason and opponents are enemies, risks the same self-destructive fate. The Byzantines left us more than ruined churches and tarnished crowns. They left a mirror, reflecting the timeless truth that power's darkest games always reveal their players eventually. The Byzantine court wasn't just a seat of power. It was a grand, gilded theater where survival demanded equal parts brilliance and brutality. For over 1,000 years, emperors and empresses, eunuchs and generals played a game where the stakes weren't just wealth or titles, but the right to wake up the next morning. What makes their stories so timeless isn't just the drama. It's the raw, unfiltered study of human nature under pressure. Every whispered conspiracy, every poisoned cup, every midnight coup reveals something universal. The lengths people will go to hold onto power and the creativity they'll unleash to tear it from others' hands. Think of Theodora, the actress turned Empress who stared down a riot and dared the court to flee, only to rule beside Justinian as his equal. Or Basil II, who didn't just defeat his enemies but erased them, leaving columns of blinded men as his gruesome signature. Even the eunuchs, those neutered power brokers, proved that influence doesn't always come from the throne itself, but from controlling who gets close enough to whisper in the ruler's ear. These weren't just historical footnotes, they were master tacticians in a game where the rules changed daily. What's chilling is how familiar it all feels. Modern politics might swap daggers for data leaks and silk robes for tailored suits, but the playbook remains eerily the same: the calculated leak to discredit a rival. The Byzantines did it with smuggled parchments, the sudden resignation of a problematic leader. They perfected it with well-timed monastic retirements. Even the way empires now outsource wars to mercenaries or rebrand crises as opportunities, these are echoes of a system that turned survival into an art form. Yet the real lesson of Byzantium isn't just about cunning, it's about cost. An empire that spent centuries perfecting the art of distrust eventually found itself too fractured to withstand a single Ottoman cannonball. The very intrigues that kept individual rulers alive slowly strangled the state they fought so hard to control. It's a warning that resonates today. When every alliance is temporary and every loyalty has a price tag, even the mightiest systems crumble from within. So tell us, which moment from this labyrinth of ambition left you stunned? Was it Anna Komnene rewriting history from her exile, or Theophano playing marital roulette with emperors' lives? Drop your thoughts below, and if you're hungry for more tales of power's dark ballet, hit that subscribe button, because history doesn't just repeat itself, it whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen.